Minister Lawrence Wong.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the speakers and members for the support of the motion. There is a time and season for everything under the sun. Members raised many issues that are outside the scope of these two acts and the motions that I've raised. But I will try, nevertheless, to address some of the points that are raised. I think Professor James Lim gave us an economics tutorial on the virtues of using debt financing, and Mr. Leong Man Wai also agreed with the merits of using debt financing. And I'm in complete agreement with the broader points that are raised, that there is scope for debt financing in Singapore. And that's why we have said that we are studying very carefully the use of borrowing for long-term infrastructure, major infrastructure projects. So that's coming, but that's not the scope of today's bills. We will have a full presentation on the government's plans when we are ready, and we can have a full debate on the extent to which debt financing is used, the limits for such borrowing, and the scope of such borrowing. So we will do that in due course. Mr. Leong asked about stat boards having excess cash. We are very mindful of the cash that is in statutory boards. That's why we have put in place a framework to look at centralized management of liquidity across the whole of government. So we, from time to time, very regularly will discuss with the statutory boards if indeed they do not have specific plans for use of these reserves. We may very well, and we have in the past, swept back the reserves into the government funds. So that has happened, and we will continue to do that. The point that Mr. Leong raised, it's a valid one. We will continue to do so. Mr. Leong also asked about budget processes. It's an area close to my heart. I started my career in the civil service as a budget officer. I know all about zero-based budgeting. We do that, right? So we have a framework of block budgets. Yes, that's to give certainty and assurance to ministries for spending and for planning. But from time to time, we go in, review ministries' projects, ministries' spending, and we take a zero-based approach to make sure that there is value for money in government spending. Finally, Mr. Leong suggested increase in taxes. Excellent. We fully support that. And when the government were to put up proposals for increase in taxes, please, we would certainly hope that the opposition members of this House would also support us in making these moves in order to strengthen our fiscal position. And I assure you, each time we make such a proposal, we will want our taxation system to be progressive. It is already a very progressive system, in fact. We've highlighted this for, many times in this House. We've said that for every tax dollar that a person pays, if it's lower income, he gets $4 in benefits, a ratio of 1 to 4. Right? Whereas if you are higher income, for every tax dollar you pay, you get much less in benefits. Right? It is already a very progressive system. Even in the way we do GST, we have introduced elements of progressivity because we have a permanent GST voucher, which we give back to the lower income. So the whole basis of our taxation system is designed to be fair, to be progressive, to enable us to move towards a fairer and more equal society. So we are in complete agreement in moving in that direction. Next, I think there were some questions raised about the assumptions. Professor James Lim asked about the assumptions behind the lifting of the debt ceilings, and I think Mr. Liang Eng Hua asked the same question. These debt ceilings for the government securities, SGS and Treasury bills, are raised periodically. I think members had highlighted it's almost like a routine exercise. The reason why we do this every 4 or 5 years is twofold, because the purposes of raising the debt ceiling and to issue bonds, SGS or SSGS, are twofold. Number one, to develop the domestic bond market, and number two, to meet the investment needs of the CPF and the CPF members. So why are we doing this? Number one, CPF needs are growing, and I've highlighted. to almost 3/4, 75% of the increase in the proposed limits will be issued for SSGS, for CPF needs. What are the assumptions behind CPF members' needs growing? It's not really about GDP, right? It's linked to resident workforce growth, CPF contribution rates. These are quite predictable, and the needs are growing, and therefore we need to cater for it. And I say it's a significant part of the increase will be put for SSGS purposes, which means for the needs for CPF and CPF members. The second area is to develop the domestic bond market. Here it's not so much about the overall economic condition, but it's about the demand for high-quality assets from financial institutions in tandem with the growth and the development of our financial markets. And we get that assessment from the MAS. They tell us that there is strong demand, continued demand. In fact, even in this period, there is continued strong demand for high-quality, safe assets. And SGS, Treasury bills are safe assets. So financial institutions have demand for these assets. We have reached the limits, and therefore we are also providing for an increase in the GSA and in the LTBA to provide to issue more SGS and the shorter-term Treasury bills. So that's the basis for raising the debt limits. I think Mr. Liang asked, how about debt issuances by the statutory boards? That's quite separate from sovereign debt, right? Statutory boards are separate legal entities from the government. The provisions, the safeguards for the issuance of debt by statutory boards are governed in their respective legislation. But for sovereign debt, SGS, Singapore Government Securities, Treasury bills, we have the two acts that we are referring to today, the Government Securities Act and the Treasury Bills Act. And the limits for issuance of debt under these two acts are set out in the Act and authorized by Parliament. And so from time to time, when we need to increase, we come back to Parliament and we seek Parliament's endorsement for an increase in these limits. Let me see which other questions. Mr. Liang asked about borrowing costs and whether we can ensure that we are able to invest well enough to pay the debts, pay the debts that we borrow through the Singapore Government Securities. And the answer is yes, right? We make sure Temasek, GIC are long-term investors. They are constantly looking out for long-term investment opportunities, and overall, we are able to meet our debt serving costs fully from the returns generated from our investments. Mr. Liang asked about borrowing for infrastructure too. I think similar, we will address that separately. He asked also about whether there will be newer variations of issuances like green bonds. That's something we will consider, quite separate from this exercise. So when we think about borrowing and using debt as a tool for fiscal policy for funding of major infrastructure projects, we will study if there are possibilities for different types of issuances, like the issuance of green bonds. And then finally, Mr. Liang asked about negative interest rates. It's something that we monitor very closely. In Singapore, the context is different because MAS uses an exchange rate policy. So it's not constrained by zero interest rate like other central banks. In that sense, our interest rates in Singapore are determined more by global interest rates. But we monitor this very carefully. I think for now, our situation is such that we expect interest rates to remain low for quite some time until we see a broader upturn in the global economy and a normalization of monetary policy. We don't expect to enter into negative interest rate territory. If that were to happen, yes, indeed, there will be impact on both borrowers and savers, and we will study very carefully should such a contingency arise, what sort of mitigating measures we can put in place. But for now, our baseline, or based on what we are looking at, I don't think we are entering a negative interest rate environment, but we do expect interest rates to remain low for a while, which, as Professor James Lim said, gives rise to the motivation to think about borrowing for projects, and like I said, that's something we are studying carefully, and we will come back to this House with a fuller presentation when we are ready and have a fuller debate on it. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I have addressed all the questions, and I beg to move.
The question is that this Parliament, in accordance with Article 144(1)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore and Section 11(1) of the Government Securities Act, Chapter 121(a) of the 2014 Revised Edition, resolves that the Minister for Finance be authorized to borrow by the issue of government securities in Singapore under that Act a further sum not exceeding 270,000 million Singapore dollars, thereby in total a sum not exceeding 970,000 million Singapore dollars. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Item 5, Treasury Bills. A motion standing in the name of the Second Minister for Finance.
Second Minister for Finance.
I beg to move that this Parliament, in accordance with Article 1441(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore and Section 3(1) of the Local Treasury Bills Act, Chapter 167 of the 2002 Revised Edition, resolves that the Minister for Finance be authorized to borrow by the issue of Treasury bills in Singapore under that Act a further sum not exceeding 45,000 million Singapore dollars, thereby in total a sum not exceeding 105,000 million Singapore dollars. Sir, Madam, I've already explained the rationale behind the need to increase the borrowing limit under the Local Treasury Bills Act during the motion to increase the borrowing limit under the Government Securities Act. So for this motion, I propose to raise the ceiling for issuing Treasury bills under the Local Treasury Bills Act by $45 billion to $105 billion. The proposed limit of $105 billion will apply to the outstanding amount of Treasury bills and is expected to last for 5 years till 2025.
The question is as moved by the Second Minister for Finance. The question is that this Parliament, in accordance with Article 144(1)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore and Section 3(1) of the Local Treasury Bills Act, Chapter 167 of the 2002 Revised Edition, resolves that the Minister for Finance be authorized to borrow by the issue of Treasury bills in Singapore under that Act a further sum not exceeding 45,000 million Singapore dollars, thereby in total a sum not exceeding 105,000 million Singapore dollars. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leader.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn to a date to be fixed.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn to a date to be fixed. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.